right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the seventh iteration of the ECARR Dialogues. I hope everyone is doing well today and staying safe. I would like to remind everyone that the meeting will be recorded, so please keep your video off and mute your mic for now. All right, and if the panelists are ready, you may turn on your camera. All right, welcome. All right. Thank you everyone for being here today. This is our program for today's webinar. And please note that we'll be live streaming on YouTube as well, and you all may get the YouTube link and recording later on. Also, please make sure to stay until the end of the webinar in order to receive your e-certificate. All right, so let's begin. The ASEAN region has been known to be the world's most dynamic and diverse in heritage of both life on land and under the sea. Living organisms are in constant motion, always interacting and depending on each other in nature. Ethics also are in constant motion and evolution. Building an ethical and resilient culture for sustainability and biodiversity is critical in the development of the ASEAN region. The current climate catastrophes across the planet, including the recent flood in Pakistan that has caused a third of the country to be underwater, nearly 300,000 homes destroyed, and more than millions of people displaced in over a span of days with little to no media attention. Population pressures and poverty lead to desperate efforts to survive, even at the expense of the environment. It is not possible to blame it on third world countries. The solution cannot prevent development to those who need it most. We are in critical need of environmental justice and sustainability now. In this dialogue today, we will hear from experts and activists from ASEAN sharing their perspectives on the ethical imperatives, as well as the important priorities and failings in ethical responsibility. Together, we will discover sources in ethical thought leadership and concrete initiatives to preserve and create economic and social value in one of the world's most important areas of biodiversity. Please welcome Dr. Bob Aubrey, founder of the ASEAN Human Development Organization, or HDO, and chair of the advisory board, to give their remark as our moderator for today.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone here. I know that there are hundreds of you that have registered for this webinar, and so I thank you very much for making the effort. This is the seventh ECARR dialogue, and so let me explain what this means. In the 2020, so going back a couple of years ago, there were three institutions that decided to collaborate on something that we thought was important, which is the need of the voice for ethics in ASEAN. That's the ASEAN University Network, which is the host of this webinar. The AHDO, the ASEAN Human Development Organization, which is represented by me, but also Pagbulo is with us today, and he's also in that organization. And then the third one is called FIRST, which is an advocate that advocates to develop and promote standards for assessing adherence to human rights. So these three organizations got together, and our mission is to identify and discuss social issues, ethical issues that are sufficient to be addressed at the ASEAN level. The ECARR dialogues provide a space for stakeholders to talk about current issues. We are neither a court of law nor a proponent of any political, moral, or religious doctrine. So welcome to the ECARR dialogue. And let's move on. Over back to you, Siri.
All right, thank you so much, Bob, for your remarks. Before we continue, we are going to have a group photo. So once again, I'd like to remind the panelists to please turn on your camera so we can take a photo together. All right, are we ready? Okay, everyone, please smile. Ready? 1, 2, 3, cheese. All right, perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Now let's proceed to the next session. Um, Featuring our first set of speakers, Ms. Anjuli Razak and Mr. Ian Mia Benedict, ASEAN Master Students in Sustainability Management from the Universitas Gadjah Mada, currently on their internship in the University of Agner in Norway. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Europe. Um, Ms. Anjuli and Mr. Ian will be presenting, and please note that you may ask questions throughout the webinar, and the ASEAN University Network team will make sure to compile them to be asked during the Q&A session right after their presentation. All right, so with this, I hand over the floor to you.
Right. Thank you so much, Siri. So, as Siri mentioned, we are students from ASEAN Master in Sustainability Management. And today we just want to give you guys a virtual tour of ASEAN biodiversity issues and efforts. So what should we know about biodiversity in ASEAN, as well as the issues and efforts that are currently happening in the region. So next slide, please. So this will be a brief overview of ASEAN biodiversity. The first point that we want to bring out is that ASEAN may be small, but at the same time, it's actually pretty big. For example, the region is already 3% of the world's total land area, but it actually contains about 18% of the known plant and animal species. So this is a very big number. And according to some studies, the biodiversity in the region provides the region with at least 2.19 trillion US dollars in terms of economic benefits or ecosystem services. So just by these data, we can see that biodiversity in the region is in fact very rich, and it's something that we need to cherish along the way. Next slide, please. And here I just want to provide an overview of the protected areas in ASEAN. So overall, we have around 2,587 protected areas. And this is approximately 800,000 square meters. And according to data, we have around 40 heritage parks. And from where I'm from in the Philippines, we have around 200 plus protected areas. And this is just in the Philippines alone. And we have 2,000 more in other parts in ASEAN. So you might be thinking, what's in it for these protected areas? First of all, is capacity building for key stakeholders. And for these protected areas, it involves many different stakeholders, from government, academia, NGOs, local communities, among others. And so it's important to create that capacity building ecosystem in the region to ensure that we sustain that biodiversity. And second is, of course, technical assistance through R&D or research and development. So many of these biodiversity areas contain, for example, threatened species, and these are areas under threat. So they need the technical assistance for R&D to sustain in the long term. And of course, finally, the implementation of policy mechanisms and frameworks. So in ASEAN, we have a wealth of policies available to us. And it's a matter of trying to synergize and finding ways of making these policies effective for protecting our biodiversity. And moving forward, what can we do as probably normal citizens and for those watching the webinar right now? Well, of course, the first one is raising public awareness. And perhaps one of the ways to do that is to create social media campaigns or collaborating on what we could do in able to protect biodiversity. And second is, of course, mobilizing financial resources. And this also is a multi-sectoral effort. We need to be able to mobilize finances in order to make the biodiversity projects successful in the long term. And of course, we need to secure alternative livelihood opportunities. So for all these different biodiversity areas, we have individuals and of course communities that are relying on livelihood in order to sustain themselves also. And it's important to note that biodiversity isn't just concerned with the marine, the flora and fauna. Of course, it also includes the human aspect. So it's something that we need to consider in the ecosystem as a whole. And finally, of course, including the indigenous peoples and local communities in decision making. So this is a matter of stakeholder involvement, keeping them in the loop, and how we could integrate them in these decision making process for biodiversity. So next slide, please. And these are some of the current biodiversity efforts in ASEAN that we'd like to share with you all. And these are also one of the main efforts currently. First one is in the Mekong River. So this involves various regional and international connectivity partnerships to promote investment and economic growth. Second, we have the heart of Borneo. So this is actually consists of a transboundary declaration between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Brunei government. And it's mainly to enhance R&D, sustainable use of the area, protection as well as education and training. Finally, we have the Coral Triangle. So this is a marine area, and it consists of a joint custodians of diverse marine ecosystem and strengthens the coastal communities. For example, number one, food security, sustainable livelihood, and species habitat protection. And in general, what I'd like to highlight is that ASEAN biodiversity is highly diverse, and it hosts thousands of plant and animal species. And most of these are endemic, meaning it's unique to the region, the country, and some specific locations. And so given this in mind, it's important for us to consider the region coordinated effort that can address biodiversity loss, as it knows basically no boundaries. For example, the marine life in the Mekong River and elephants in Borneo migrate between countries. So we have that aspect to consider. And finally, over 600 million people depend on this biodiversity for food, health, and livelihood. So that's where the ecosystem aspect comes in also. So next slide, please. And another message that we'd want to provide with you all is that, as we can see, so ASEAN is growing fast. It's growing rapidly in the past years, the past decades, but at the same time, it's affecting our biodiversity in the region. And with that, biodiversity loss has become a key environmental issue in the ASEAN region. And as of now, the region is already estimated to lost around 95% of its original habitats, according to studies. And as I mentioned before, a loss of biodiversity leads to a loss in ecosystem services. And these are basically the basic services that make life possible for us in terms of food, water, recreation, tourism, and many others. And here I wanted to show one of the critical species that we have currently, which is the Sumatran orangutan. And this is originally from Indonesia, and it is a critically endangered species threatened by hunting and habitat loss. So this is one of the, sadly, one of the consequences of a rapid economic growth in the region, and something that we have to put into consideration as well. So next slide, please. And just to provide another brief overview of the motivations of where are we coming from. So biodiversity loss has a lot of, it's coming from many different drivers and influencers. But first, let's start with the influencers. So we have human population growth. As we know in ASEAN, it's continuing to grow as we speak. Every year on year, population continues to grow. And there's also increasing consumption levels. As ASEAN becomes more and more affluent throughout the years, we're increasing a rise in consumption levels. And of course, reduced resource efficiency. So in terms of businesses, we need to make sure that the way they use resources are aligned with the limits with biodiversity. And what do these things influence? So we have several primary drivers. So from habitat loss down to climate change associated with global warming. So biodiversity loss isn't something that is simple. It's something that involves different drivers. For example, in terms of habitat loss, we have their thinning, fragmenting, or the outright destruction of an ecosystem's different kinds of resources. And we also have invasive species. So whenever an alien species is introduced to a new ecosystem, it significantly modifies the makeup of that ecosystem. Of course, we have overexploitation. For example, businesses process of harvesting too many aquatic or terrestrial animals. And this depletes some of these species while driving some other species into extinction. Of course, we have pollution. So whenever we add any substance to the environment at a rate faster than it can be rendered harmless. So these different kinds of pollution also contributes to biodiversity loss. And in terms of climate change associated with global warming, so this is the most recent that's being put into attention. For example, with the rise of greenhouse gases that we're bringing into the atmosphere. Of course, it heats up the planet and it affects various ecosystems. For example, we're seeing more forest fires in the world. In Europe, for example, the heat wave is becoming more prominent. So climate change is also causing biodiversity loss. Ultimately, so biodiversity loss, it leads to the reduction of individual organisms, species, and ecosystems in specific areas. So this is the perhaps the overview of what we wanted to share with you all today. So next slide, please. For this part, that will be shared by my classmate, Anjali. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ian. So now that Ian has briefly given us the scope of biodiversity efforts across the ASEAN landscape, let's shift our focus towards the elements of ethics and how it actually plays a significant role within the ASEAN natural resource management. And when we talk about ethics, it can be a little bit tricky to discuss because in essence, we'll need to talk about how our actions and their weight of being either right or wrong, morally good or bad. And unfortunately, these issues are not so straightforward as in the case of emerging ASEAN ethics. And what we mean here by emerging ASEAN ethics are concepts or moral principles at a regional scale, and they are not necessarily present during the formation of ASEAN, but can be and will be evolving throughout the time. So next. So as with the topic of today, how does ethics play a role in sustainability and biodiversity within the context of ASEAN? We've kind of narrowed it down to 3 levels. First, at the individual, the group level, and as well as the systemic level. Next. So when it comes to the individual level, we'll talk a little bit about how ethics play a role as part of our identity. And in the case of biodiversity, it has indirectly and directly been embedded in ASEAN's way of life. And it is known that our deep-rooted beliefs from our agricultural ancestors who understood back in the days without even having the grasp of science that it was important to maintain a certain level of biodiversity within their environment, as destroying them would essentially mean destroying their means of survival, basically. And this is why also historically indigenous beliefs tend to be leaning into animistic faiths, placing certain or specific animals as sacred, simply because it was understood that it represents sanctity of life itself. And these beliefs eventually over time translated into our way of life as ASEANs, into what we eat, what we wear, and what form of ideologies we take on as a personal stance, and what we want to bring forth in an implicit and explicit manner. So next. And the diversity of flora and fauna is further translated at the community or society level. which somehow resulted in ASEAN's nature of pluralism, the diversity of culture, diversity of passed down traditions, religion, and even political views. And it is important to highlight that this diversity also somehow, in a way, affected the fragmentation of including everyone in the form of ethics of the marginalized, in this case, indigenous people, those who are in the rural and urban poor. They are often sidelined in policymaking. And why is that? This is simply because these ethics of the marginalized are considered as emerging ethics, ethics that were not taken account for previously. And this can be a grave concern as more and more of ASEAN citizens are exposed to the threats of climate change. And therefore, we have to acknowledge that the worsening threat of biodiversity loss would also threat upon human rights, as well as the equitable living of the marginalized. Next. And when we take on the bigger picture or the macro aspect of things, we'll talk about the economy and livelihoods. And we would like to stress upon this when it comes to ethics. ASEAN is put under the spotlight, so to speak, as it struggles to balance between the economic growth and biodiversity loss. So as the region grows economically stronger, it is prospected to become the fourth largest economy in the world. The likelihood of climate change is jeopardizing this growth trajectory and is becoming more apparent. So as we can see how we have gone through the pandemic, our tourism and service sector, two of the major economies of the ASEAN region, was badly hit and infected millions and millions of people. So we like to call on to focus on more on the value-added economic outputs, as opposed to just direct production. Thank you. So next. So we've mostly talked about how ASEAN member states can play a role, but we also like to shift the focus a little bit on the private sector. And when we talk about ethics and the private sector, most of the concepts that come across would be about greenwashing. And it is, we have to acknowledge that it is a subtle threat to biodiversity. And the concern of sustainability in ASEAN is, we can acknowledge that it is a bit lagging from the developed nations, but nevertheless, it is growing, which is good. And as businesses try to market sustainability into their practices, the holistic approach is often shortchanged and is misrepresented in the form of labels or highly promoted CSR events, and even ESG reporting. So the environmental, social, and governance reporting is trending in ASEAN, but with hindsight of developed nation markets in which ESG reporting can already be considered as a taboo, businesses and consumers alike must be alert on the adverse effects of greenwashing. And it is true, while a company cannot be completely 100% sustainable, and these type of entities should at least try to strive to be as close as possible to sustainability and addressing the complexities and interconnected problems. Next. So while we do acknowledge the nature of pluralism and fragmented views on ethics, ASEAN must not be divided when it comes to protecting the interests of the ecosystem. Because as Ian has mentioned, the ecosystem that the region shares, it has no boundaries, basically. And member states must get together and establish regionally accepted norms and focus on efforts that play upon the region's strengths rather than weaknesses. So we like to call upon the focus on nature-based solutions, blue carbon economy, capacity building, and or stakeholder coordination. And essentially, ecosystem-based management must be holistic enough to address the complexities of ASEAN biodiversity issues. This is not just from a policy-making perspective, but also down to the implementation on the ground. Next. So as much as today's presentations focus on the role of member states, it is also important to highlight that the biodiversity protection is not just a job for governments. All international, non-governmental, private sector individuals, such as myself, such as Ian, and everybody that is listening in this webinar as well, each have a role to play in the final outcome and overcoming destructive patterns of behavior. And with that, we'd like to end our keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Very important, because there's a massive diversity of the issue, and I think you've handled very well to give us an overview, a sort of map, as well as to understand the ethical issues. We have a couple of questions, but before we come to that, I just want to ask one to Ian. You've become a sustainability expert. You're in a program to become a master, right? So was that an ethical decision, or why are you getting into this? Ian?
Thank you, Bob. So hi everyone, I'm Ian from ASEAN MBA, and well, my deep motivation really is the urgency of the climate crisis. Of course, my classmates and I would agree that one of the reasons we joined this program is to help contribute to that solution, and hopefully later on establish ourselves as a full-fledged sustainability professional. So I would say that would be our main motivation.
Okay, thanks. And then a question for Anjali, and you led very well into this, Ian. So you're coming out of this program as a sustainability expert, right? Is that actually valued and recognized in ASEAN according to your experience? What do you think, Anjali?
Yeah, so the concept of sustainability in the ASEAN context, I would say it's still growing and not as mature as the developed nations. But I think for us as future graduates of this course, we have the responsibility to show what kind of value that we can bring forward towards the ASEAN economy. So that's a really interesting prospect.
So I hope you're getting lots of job offers to be able to do the work, because this is something new in ASEAN. This is the first degree program at the master's level in sustainability. So it's something that's very much needed, and like to recognize. I think we've got a couple of questions, Siri, from the audience. I see one on the chat from Munching Yap.
Yes, I'll ask that. So the question is, can you please elaborate on the point that ESG reporting is taboo in developed countries when speaking on greenwashing?
So is it taboo? I think maybe she's referring to what's going on in the United States, where you have some companies or some states like Texas that is actually saying that companies that are promoting ESG will not be able to be funded in the state of Texas. So it's a debate, right? What's your take on it, guys?
Yeah, so I would agree that it is a growing debate in developed nations, in a sense that they are realizing that as much as ESG reporting is growing there, the effects, or rather the impacts of how companies report, how companies focus too much on either the E, S, or G. There's even talks about maybe we should focus simply on the E itself, or by focusing on E, then only you can move on to S and G. So there's a lot of talks about it, but also the kind of the reputation of ESG has been quite tampered with, simply because people feel, or consumers feel, that companies are not addressing the issue well enough, and they are using ESG reporting as a form of greenwashing.
Okay, thanks. Well, maybe we can do the other side of that question. So those are developed countries in which there has been already a lot of debate going, and then there's opposition to the debate. What about ASEAN? The other side of this question is this: what are companies actually embracing biodiversity and sustainability? Ian, what's your experience in ASEAN companies?
For ASEAN companies, when it comes to ESG, well, there was this recent report released on sustainability reporting in ASEAN, and I think it's still at an early stage, but we're going there. And we're already seeing many companies starting to do ESG reporting. And in their reports, they include, for example, what are the biodiversity policies of these companies and what are they doing to help contribute to the protection of the ecosystems and several other initiatives. And probably I would say as compared to, well, developed nations, ASEAN is actually at a advantageous position since we're still just starting with ESG reporting and biodiversity initiatives. We have the potential to do better and build better since we already know, if we don't do these reporting initiatives, what would happen? And we already have that foundation. And so given that, moving forward later on, we can already create better frameworks, mechanisms on sustainability reporting. So I think that's one optimistic way to look at it.
So we still have a lot of diversity, but the fact that you showed that 95% of the habitat loss is already happened really makes this urgent, doesn't it? Siri, we have another question, right?
Yes.
You wanna take that one?
Okay, so the question is, how does modernization sustain a balanced biodiversity across AMS? We know some countries are reclaiming land and destroying natural habitats. In Singapore, we see wild boars appearing in neighborhood areas.
Okay, wild boars, otters in Singapore. Yeah, so basically it's this, and this is really the ethical question, isn't it? We want to have economic development, but economic development is destroying our sustainability and biodiversity. You have to do both in a sense. So how do you find that balance? Anjali, how would you like to begin?
Yeah, so from this question, I see two things. One is, again, we are struggling, ASEAN is struggling to find that balance. And the other thing about the wild boars is the human and wildlife conflict, which kind of came about simply because we were unable to find this balance. And even the pandemic is because wildlife management or forest fragmentation was not managed properly in the expense of economic development. So I would say, how do we find that balance? Again, we can refer back to our question of ethics in terms of what we see is more important. Do we focus on simply prosperity and shortchanging and having to compensate on social livelihoods, or do we try to find both where we can prosper and have that social development as well? And I think in essential is that we need to ensure that whatever approach we take has to address all these complexities, because it's not a straightforward answer. You can't just make money and without considering the other factors, because eventually it would worsen over time and it can come up with a pretty hefty cost in the future as well. So yeah, that's my answer to that.
Ian, what's your take quickly? Because we have a couple of more questions and we have about 5 more minutes.
Yeah. Well, I suppose this is where lessons learned and best practices come in. We can't actually say that any single country has already balanced these two aspects of economic growth and biodiversity. Well, Bhutan could be an example country. But at the same time, of course, Bhutan also has its disadvantages as well as flaws. But my point is, it's all about sharing that knowledge, because we can never be perfectly sustainable, and it's something that we need to consider along the way.
Thanks. Okay. So there's another question that's okay. So it's not a question; it's a continuation of my earlier question, and about group sustainability. So it's a rather long statement about a competency framework will be enhanced. So the question is: expert roles are up for grabs and demand in the employment scene. So are you seeing these kind of, let's say, government-sponsored needs for what you guys are learning in the master degree? And are you learning also about competency frameworks and new kinds of frameworks that you can actually use for applications? Let's just take a short answer. I know it's a long thing, and then we have just a couple of other quick questions. So just give it your shot. Anjali.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the question. But yeah, basically in terms of learning about reporting in our course, it's not too focused yet, I would say, because it's still fairly new in the ASEAN context, and we sort of focus more on the bigger. We try to take a step back in terms of our sustainability perspective, and I would also want to say, in terms of sustainability reporting, is just one of the many steps that companies can take in terms of approaching sustainability. So we do acknowledge that is a possible step to take, but it's not the ultimate solution. That's my take.
All right, so I'm going to try to tap quickly on just a 1 minute kind of thing. With one of the questions from Mel Gregg is, what about food sustainability for marginalized people? Ian, are you guys working on specific populations for biodiversity?
Right, so thank you for that question. Well, to be frank with you, personally, I haven't worked extensively in food sustainability, but my understanding on this issue is that, for example, in the Philippines, before I was part of a nonprofit organization, and part of our program are feeding programs. You all know feeding programs, but I think it's good for a short term, but my criticism is that it's not sustainable in the long term. We can't keep on organizing feeding programs. We have to have a more systemic approach to it. Hence the saying that goes, instead of giving man a fish, we have to teach them how to fish. So it's something that when it comes to food sustainability, or if I understand your question correctly, in terms of food sustainability, it's something that we need to consider as well. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Anjali. A quick one to end it. You talked about ESG, right? So you're really emphasizing the E, and this question is jumping on the G. So that's the problem, right? And the S is sort of where the human development issue is, and we'll talk about that later. But what about the G? Are you guys also really concerned about the governance issue of nations, of ASEAN itself, and obviously of companies? What's your take on that, Anjali?
Right. So this would be my personal take. I still think that we should focus on E first, and then somehow one way or another, the S and G will come along. Because if you don't take care of the environment, the other factors, the social, the governments, would not transpire, would not materialize. So if we are well documenting what are the impacts of environment, at least we can see, okay, if we are lacking in terms of environment, we can see that the effects from social and governance as well. So yeah, I
Okay.
would say focus more on the
You're an E person. Okay, great.
yeah. Might be
Thank you.
biased. That's my ethics.
Okay. Well, you should be. That's what you're learning. Okay, great. Thanks. And we're going to have you both back when we do the panel discussion. So there may be some other questions that come up. But now what we want to do is to move to this video. And I'd just like to say a couple of words, Siri, before we run it, because most of you don't know what COP15 is about, because it's something that's quite new. And COP means it's the Convention of Parties, and the 15 is about biodiversity. And so that's what this video is about. Siri, maybe you can introduce it a bit more.
Yes, of course. All right. So thank you, Julie and Ian, again for such a wonderful presentation. And now we have a special video on COP15 by the UN Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So please welcome Ms. Bianca Lisboa de Camara Brazil, Program Manager for Business Engagement at the Secretariat for Convention on Biological Diversity.
Right. So this was pre-recorded specifically for this webinar by the United Nations.
In December of this year, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity will convene in Montreal, Canada, for the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. It will be the stage for the final round of negotiations and the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This global agreement will be the blueprint for governments, local authorities, civil society, indigenous peoples, and local communities, women and girls, business and industry, academia and youth around the globe on the steps we need to take to safeguard our livelihoods, our health, and the health of the planet. The three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity are the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from the utilization of genetic resources. Biodiversity underpins all life on Earth, from the water we drink, the food we eat, the air we breathe, the fiber we wear. Biodiversity is everywhere. I want to reach out to the Asian region, which occupies only 3% of the Earth's surface, but around approximately 20% of the planet's vertebrates and plant species live. The region is also home to 4 biodiversity hotspots, 3 of the 17 mega-diverse countries in the world, and 620 million people. That is quite remarkable. The interconnected health, climate, and biodiversity crises touch all our lives, and yet we are knowingly destroying the life support systems of this planet. The human side of the Global Biodiversity Framework appears, amongst others, in the form of a commitment of parties to the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits that arise from the use of biodiversity. This strives to the level playing field in terms of research and innovation, knowledge and training in all sectors of the economy that uses plant, animals, microbes, or pathogens. Everything is connected, from economies to ecosystems, from forests to oceans, prosperity to health. And in a historic decision, the United Nations members passed a resolution earlier this year to recognize the right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment as a human right. This could have a trickle-down effect, prompting countries to enshrine the right to a healthy environment in national constitutions and treaties, as it should be. We will take advantage of this reckoning on the importance of ecosystems and biodiversity to support the 196 parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity to adopt this framework. We all need a healthy, resilient, and balanced environment so we can all thrive on. Biodiversity is at the heart of our well-being, and we must be at the center of our intentions.
Thank you. So just let me just make 2 points on this because the video went very fast. The first thing that she says that's remarkable, and that's why you should keep an eye on COP15. It starts in November, the first meeting, is that they're taking biodiversity from a genetic point of view and saying where that source is of the genetic code can actually be supported financially, that there's an economic benefit for the place in which that code comes from. As ASEAN has a huge amount of biodiversity, this means that there should be an economic benefit coming from that convention for preserving the biodiversity of different species. The second thing that she says is that UN is promoting a new human right, which is a human right to an environment, and a clean and biodiverse environment. So these are quite important steps that the United Nations is taking. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that series. So what happens next?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rob. All right, so thank you so much for the video again. And now let's take a 10-minute break before we move on to our next session of today. We should reconvene around 9:55, if that's all right with everyone. So I hope to see you all very soon. Thank
It's
you.
a 5-minute break. And thanks for the questions that you're writing in. We'll try to get to them.
Please send in all the questions. We'll try to answer them live or also type in the answers as well in the Q&A section. So thank you so much. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the webinar.
I'm here. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, I started typing the answers, and you get focused on the Q&A. Thanks for the questions, guys.
Yes, thank you for sending them all in, and thank you for the speakers for answering them throughout our break. I know you guys were like in front of the computer nonstop typing, so thank you so much. All right, allow me to like have some time for everyone to settle down. I'll wait for the numbers to come back up for a little bit. All right. Okay, so welcome back everyone. We'll be starting our panel discussions very soon. So thank you for moving towards the next session of our webinar. We will be featuring 3 speakers with expertise and interest in various areas of environmental sustainability and management in Southeast Asia. So for the first panel, please welcome Dr. Mary Christeri Baleva, or Dr. Chris, External Relations and Policy Specialist from the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, for our first panel. She is the author of Regaining Paradise Lost, Indigenous Land Rights and Tourism, using the UNGPs on business and human rights in mainstreaming Indigenous land rights in the tourism industry, published by Brill Nijov as part of its International Studies in Human Rights collection. Please welcome Dr. Chris.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you again for this invitation and for this opportunity to be talking to very interested and very engaged audience. It was quite serendipitous, that I followed, that my presentation is following the video from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, because the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, which is the ASEAN Center for Excellence in Biodiversity, is very much involved in the negotiations at the COP15, or the 15th Conference of the Parties, 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And all the 10 ASEAN member states are very engaged in these negotiations. As you would know, all the 10 ASEAN member states are state parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this certainly shows the level of commitment in the region towards the sustainable use, the conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing of our very rich biological resources here in the region. And the CBD is a legally binding treaty. And so being a state party to the CBD certainly shows commitment and the willingness to work together towards these 3 goals of the CBD. That being said, all 10 ASEAN member states are also members of the state parties to the UNFCCC, and to varying degrees. They are also members. Some are members to a number of the other multilateral environmental agreements. And this is where we try to find synergies among these legally binding treaties, and the commitments and obligations, the responsibilities that the states have under these legally binding treaties to come up with a comprehensive response to biodiversity loss and to other cross-cutting issues such as climate change, pandemics, and all these global challenges that we are facing. Well, that being said, let's talk about biodiversity. We've been hearing biodiversity in ecosystems and ecosystem services, that it would be good to just find out, be on the same page on what biodiversity means. So very quickly, the CBD, or the Convention on Biological Diversity, defines biodiversity, or biological diversity, as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So essentially, biodiversity is all life on Earth, and that includes human life. So from the smallest of organisms to the biggest of vertebrate mammals, uh, it's all part of biodiversity. And the ecosystems, are the areas in which you move, the spatial areas in which the different species move. And so that's biodiversity. And when we talk about biodiversity, we pertain to three component levels: the genetic, the species, and the ecosystem levels. So just from that short discussion alone, we see how interconnected and interdependent things are when we talk about biodiversity. And Ian said something about how complex it is. It is very complex because of the interdependence of within biodiversity. And ecosystems, these are dynamic complexes, plant, animal, and microorganism communities in their non-living environment interacting as a functional unit. And so remember from the video from the Secretariat, she talked about uh, the value of biodiversity and ecosystems, the very air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the fiber that we wear, and these are parts of ecosystem services. So there are four major ecosystem services, provisioning services, and these are the goods that supply direct benefits to people, and they often have clear monetary values, such as timber from forests, medicinal plants, fish from the oceans, rivers, and lakes. And then you have regulating services, which includes, the regulation of climate through the storing of carbon and control of local rainfall, the removal of pollutants by filtering air and water, and the protection from disasters such as landslides and coastal storms. The third are cultural services, and these include spiritual value attached to particular ecosystems such as sacred groves and the aesthetic beauty of landscapes or coastal formations that attract tourists. And the fourth are supporting services, which may have indirect benefit to people but are essential to the functioning of ecosystems and therefore indirectly responsible for all other services. And this includes the formation of soils and the processes of plant growth. Um, so having seen all this, we appreciate the value of science-based policy making, given this interdependence and given these complex processes that are happening within biodiversity and ecosystems. Can we go back to the previous slides, please? So let's go back to biodiversity in the ASEAN region. Wonderful, thank you. So our previous speakers have already spoken to us about this. So we have a very small area here in the ASEAN, 3% of the total surface area of the world, and yet 18 to 20% of all known plants and animals throughout the globe are found in the ASEAN, and there are 37 species in the ASEAN that are endemic to the region, which means you can only find these species in the region. And it's just the tip of the iceberg because this is still the age of discovery, and there will be more to discover, more new species to discover. And so for those who are interested in discovering these species, then you're most welcome to do so because of the rich biodiversity here in the ASEAN, and ASEAN would be the best place to do it. Next slide, please. So the region has 3 of the world's 17 megadiverse countries, and 5 countries in the Indo-Burma region, considered as one of the most biologically important regions in the planet. We also have the heart of Borneo, which was mentioned earlier. This is 22 million hectares, and it's one of the largest transboundary protected forests in the world. It covers Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei Darussalam. And we've heard about how species do not need visas. There are no boundaries among species, And this is why transboundary protected areas, such as the heart of Borneo, is important because of migratory species, the interconnectivity of the land areas and the marine areas are so important so that you wouldn't have fragmentation among and within ecosystems. So these transboundary protected forests certainly provide value, not just in the region, but throughout the world. Next slide, please. So biodiversity is crucial to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, and directly contributes to the achievement of goals 2, 3, 6, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 17. And so this is where food security comes in, which is why it's important to mainstream biodiversity into various development sectors, including agriculture and aquaculture. Then you have how important it is to mainstream biodiversity considerations into infrastructure and manufacturing and production. Certainly, it's important to mainstream it into health and the well-being of both animal and human species, water above the earth and below the water. So these are all things that are part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and where biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable use thereof, and of course, the equitable sharing of benefits from the use of these biological resources certainly figure into the equation. Next slide, please. So because we are talking about ethics of biodiversity, it's important to see the value, the diverse value of biodiversity. We've touched upon how valuable it is to some extent, in that we will, the very survival of humanity, of people and planet relies on biodiversity. And it does show the richness of humanity's relationships with nature. And this would include the worldviews of humanity, where people conceive, the ways in which people conceive and interact with the world, the knowledge systems, the bodies of knowledge, practices, and beliefs such as academic, indigenous, and local knowledge systems that are embodied in these worldviews. And this wonderful graphic is from the Intergovernment Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, which is like a scientific arm of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so you see a number of a number of views there, a number of ways that people interact and have a relationship with nature. So apart from worldviews, there are broader values such as justice, human rights, and equitable sharing of benefits, fairness. So those are the broader views that we have. These are moral principles and goals that guide people-nature interactions. There are specific values where you have, the means to a desired end, often associated with the notion of ecosystem services, relational values, and very importantly, intrinsic value. Because we have talked about the economic value of biodiversity. That's where we have specific qualitative figures that represent the value of biodiversity in monetary form. But apart from the economic value of biodiversity, there's certainly the intrinsic value of biodiversity, that it has inherent value that over and beyond the economic value, it is important, it has value in itself. And then you also have value indicators, and this is where economic figures come in, where you have qualitative and quantitative measures and descriptions used to denote the value or the importance of nature in terms of by physical, monetary, or sociological and cultural metrics. And these worldviews, these views, and these values that we attach to nature and biodiversity help us to promote decision making. And the the hope here and the goal here is to come up with science-based policy and decision making and implementation, considering the complex relationships within among species and their ecosystems. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So one of the important publications that came out more recently is this Gupta review, and this is a review on the value of biodiversity, the value of nature. And one of the greatest takeaways is that economic measures of success need to be improved because inclusive wealth is the appropriate main measure of sustainable economic prosperity. So there is an imbalance in the distribution of wealth in around the globe, and the one of the things that we need to think about is inclusive wealth, inclusive sustainability and prosperity, and that would mean having a multi-sectoral, multilateral approach. And in the ASEAN, we call it a whole of community approach to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, to pandemic response, recovery, and prevention. And the more value that we give to our natural capital, the the bigger likelihood it is that we will be able to attain a level of sustainability that would certainly be able to address the needs not just of the current generation but of the future generation, which is exactly what sustainability is. There is it's well established that we have economic metrics to measure the value of biodiversity, but even in that regard, there is still a lot of studies that we need to do, even about just the economic value of biodiversity. But because of the interconnectedness of these things, economic value is not enough. You would have to think about its cultural value, its value to its inherent or intrinsic value, and therein lies the challenge when we talk about natural capital valuation. But given that challenge, there's a lot of opportunity for discourse and studies, and I invite you. I know that there are a lot of students here in the audience to look at that sustainability in terms of natural capital valuation and recognizing the diverse values of biodiversity. Next slide, please. So here we talk about bringing the values of nature. Ecological civilization is the theme of the CBD COP15 that is hosted by China, and that will take place. The second part of it will take place in Montreal, Canada. And so we see here that there needs to be both a horizontal and vertical approach to policy making. It can't just be top down, but there has to be interactions and consultations and the engagement, the inclusive engagement of the various stakeholders, including indigenous peoples and local communities, including the youth, women, and children, and girls. Next slide, please. So what is it that the ASEAN member states are doing in terms of their commitment to biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and the equitable sharing of benefits? Well, they created the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity in 2005. All 10 ASEAN member states created the ACB, and it's the only ASEAN center that's hosted by the Philippines. And its main mandate, the ethos of the work of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, is to bring the ASEAN member states together and facilitate their concerted actions towards the achievement of the three goals of the CBD, and to find synergies among the multilateral environmental agreements, including the UNFCCC, and harnessing the much needed partnerships among stakeholders to come up with a whole of community approach towards the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Next slide, please. So there are a number of initiatives that the ATB has been doing, and this is really just a sneak peek of these initiatives. There are studies on ecosystem services valuation, conservation financing, and climate change impacts are being conducted by the ACB to enhance existing knowledge and information on biodiversity in the region. Through one of its main programs, the ASEAN EU PCAP project, a rapid regional assessment of gaps in existing biodiversity and ecosystem services assessment and valuation research has been conducted. The project has, next slide please, the project has three components: site level intervention in selected and future ASEAN heritage parks. ASEAN Heritage Parks is it's one of the flagship programs of the ASEAN, where protected areas of unique value are being recognized. Next slide, please. The second, under the BCAMP project, is enabling support at the national level. And the third is regional level intervention. So you see that we talked about not just having a top-down approach, but also a vertical approach. So that's why there's site level intervention, there's enabling support at the national level, and of course, there's regional level intervention to bring them all together. Next slide, please. And then recognizing the crucial role of the youth, BCAMP also is instrumental in strengthening the youth's participation in protected area management and biodiversity conservation at the local, national, and international levels. And in fact, there are youth delegates to the CBD COP15 so that the voice of the youth would be heard in these very important negotiations towards the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which the Secretariat mentioned would be the blueprint for towards the achievement of the three goals of the CBD towards living in harmony with nature by 2050. And part of that process is the ASEAN joint statement that was delivered during the first part of the high-level segment of the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15. The second part will be in Montreal, Canada, and certainly the youth lent its voice to this process, and even processes under the other multilateral environmental agreements. There will be the COP14, so the Conference of the Parties, the meeting of the parties of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands that will be held in October or November this year. And one of the side events that we are proposing is, a youth dialogue with experts, something like this, I suppose, where you have much older people talking about their experiences and the youth sharing their own experiences and having a divergence, if you will, of a meeting of minds towards these lofty goals. And part of this whole process is the Young ASEAN Storytellers program that was launched in June, and it's designed to engage 20 youth leaders in the region as the voice of the youth for biodiversity-related issues. It aims to raise awareness in the ASEAN as well as in the global community and the importance of biodiversity conservation through inspiring stories of conservation. So this is just the first leg of the Young ASEAN Storytellers. There is a question earlier about opportunities for sustainability work. And certainly, apart from the Young Biodiversity Leaders program that the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity has. There are also secondment programs to the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity that you might all be interested in. Next slide, please. So another of the ACB's programs is the BBP, or the Biodiversity-Based Products Program. It has recently been completed, and we're looking at continuing this program because it has established 7 successful pilots of biodiversity-based value chains, which provide sustainable income and enhance biodiversity conservation at the community level. So this program actually provides assistance to communities that are living within and near protected areas, so that they would be able to use the resources within their areas in a sustainable manner, and have that part of the value chain for the production and the disposal of their projects. And there were questions about what greenwashing earlier, and it's really important that biodiversity conservation, biodiversity considerations are mainstreamed into development sectors, including business, particularly business, because we hear a lot of CSR activities, and those are wonderful, but going beyond CSR is what we're looking for, in that biodiversity considerations would have to be part of the business model, the very ethos of companies, so that biodiversity, the risks and the opportunities of the use of biodiversity would not just be part of how they spend money on corporate social responsibility activities, but actually how they make money, how they earn their money. And so that would have to be part of the very ethos of the very business model of a corporation.
Nice.
And
So we're
to a
getting
certain
bit
level.
over time. So can we, do you have any more slides?
Yes, just a couple more.
5
Next
minutes.
slide, please.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we move on to the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, which is the blueprint of the ASEAN towards pandemic response, recovery, and prevention. And it does recognize the importance of sustainability and biodiversity in the process for prevention and recovery from pandemic. So there was a webinar on biodiversity and building resilience, the impacts of climate change in the ASEAN. There were a number of webinars on the prevention of future pandemics, and another on the framing the future for nature and climate, where we had Sir David Attenborough as one of the keynote speakers. Next slide, please. And then we have the ASEAN Green Initiative, which is 10-10-10. The goal is to nurture at least 10 million native trees across 10 ASEAN member states in 10 years. That's a multi-sectoral approach to ecosystem restoration, and it seeks to contribute to the UN Decade in Ecosystem Restoration. Next slide, please. And then we have the ASEAN Heritage Parks program. There are 51 ASEAN Heritage Parks across the region, and we are looking at having more transboundary ASEAN Heritage Parks for greater protection of connectivity among these protected areas. Next slide, please. And finally, allow me to end with, are we able to show the video?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Wonderful. Please allow us to show a video that we hope would inspire you and remind you of the ethical considerations when we talk about biodiversity conservation and sustainable use.
Thank you, Dr. Chris.
of the earth.
And ASEAN is our home.
It is rich with natural heritage.
The mountains,
the farmlands,
the cities,
the rivers,
the wetland.
Nature provides for us all.
Air,
nourishment,
shelter and protection,
jobs and livelihood, and the medicine to prevent diseases. But humankind has taken more than nature can provide.
What was convenient for us has become harmful for all life on Earth. We have caused a crisis that is slowly destroying nature,
affecting us all.
It is time to set things right.
We can still mend our broken relationship with nature.
And with each other.
Plant native trees, regrow our forests,
maintain the natural fertility of our soils,
stop destructive fishing practices,
keep our waters free from litter, harness the power of clean energy,
become responsible tourists,
respect local culture,
design greener cities, foster sustainable communities.
Saving biodiversity means saving lives.
To secure our future, we must nurture nature.
For our only home.
Why wait for the next crisis to happen? It's time to act now.
For ASEAN.
For biodiversity.
For nature. Ako ay bahagi ng solusyon.
เราคือส่วนหนึ่งของการแก้ปัญหา
Tôi là một phần của giải pháp.
I am the part of the solution.
I am 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 part of the solution.
We
are part of the solution.
Are you?
Very nice video. Thank you, Dr. Chris. Just one question before we transition over to the business side. It seems that this is a fairly new center, and you're doing an immense amount of work with an immense scope of responsibilities. I'd like to know, just from your personal point of view, what keeps you up at night? What is the major thing that you're working on that sort of frustrates you, that you'd like to do more of?
Well, it doesn't really frustrate me, but what keeps me up at night and what keeps me going is how engaged the ASEAN member states are, particularly in the negotiations at COP15. Right. So this is a very important COP because it seeks the adoption of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which we've mentioned will be the blueprint for the entire world for sustainability, for the conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity. And this cuts across so many sectors. We cannot talk about climate change and climate action without talking about biodiversity.
Right.
We cannot talk about sustainability without talking about biodiversity. And so the fact that the ASEAN member states are so engaged and that the ACB is helping the ASEAN member states have a strong voice nationally and as a region in these very important negotiations certainly keeps me happily up at night.
Okay, so actually that's good news.
Important work, yeah.
So you are getting, that was a question I wanted to ask, is are you getting strong support from the ASEAN nations? And it sounds like the answer is yes.
Certainly, yes. Okay. Yeah.
That's good to know.
And the support is actually from different levels. Right. So there are discussions at the local levels, the city levels. There's an Edinburgh Declaration on, subnational government, and that's certainly part of the discourse. And so like we said, it's not just top down, but also vertical in terms of the discourse on the post 2020 global biodiversity framework in the ASEAN.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to come back to you in the panel discussion. So all of you who are with us now, go ahead and start asking questions. We'll come back to that. But now I want to switch our next speaker. Siri, do you want to introduce Julius Bulo?
Yes, hello. Hello, yes. All right, thank you so much again, Dr. Chris. So now we'll be moving on to Julius Bulo, Operation Director at Pertamina Foundation and Senior Liaison Officer to ASEAN from the ASEAN Human Development Organization in Indonesia. Please welcome Julius.
So you have a heavy weight on your shoulders because we're all talking about business as greenwashing and pollution. So please tell us what you're doing.
All right. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Bob Aubrey from ECARR for the opportunity to share my thought in this very important forum. And indeed that I have a heavy shoulder as, you know, the one that will be accused as doing greenwashings are companies, right? So I think this is a really good opportunity, and I think allow me, ladies and gentlemen, today to share about the sustainable business management practice and how it is driven by the improving concern about the environment, social, and governance. So I know that there was questions that saying that ESG words or ESG rating is taboo in some developed countries, but I think we still need some ratings to say that we are on the right track and we have the power to claim that we are doing the things correctly and in the same quality compared to others. So I think that's the idea. And for my discussions, I will present my opinions and sharing our company's practices verbally, and I don't prepare any slides. So hopefully you can stay engaged with me for the coming minutes. Right, so yes, as we all know that ESG rating indicates the potential risk a company has toward the environment. And the questions then, when a company has any sustainability initiative, is it driven by the rating or showcasings, I would say, or is it merely driven by authentic sustainability motive, or in other words, ethical? So, well, both ways can be correct. There is no wrong answers, but in my humble opinions, the answer will determine the effort and the sincerity about one company's ethic toward the environment. So I think that's the thing to start with. When you're doing things only for the ratings, probably you will do things that might be included as greenwashing as well, because your motive is just the rating. But if you are doing things because you have the authentic sustainability, it is motivated by ethics. So I think that's would be a better way to choose if you have your, I would say, your calling. And in this case, to talk representing the industries, I do believe that there are many other good examples of good practices out there. But in this opportunity, allow me to use Pertamina situations to illustrate about sustainable initiative in large energy corporations and how the way it supports the climate transitions agenda and sustainability policies within the company, as well as in accordance with the country's policy. So
Not everybody knows Pertamina, so can you?
Oh yeah. Well,
Okay.
yeah, okay. Pertamina is one of the global Fortune 500 company. This is the Indonesia's state-owned enterprise that operates in energy businesses. So I think for me to picking up this company is, I think, is quite relevant with the event, because this company is the one that is being spotlighted as energy company in general, being spotlighted as doing harm to environment. But I think, yeah, it can illustrate how when we have the perfect calling, when we have the perfect response toward the issues, we can come to a better actions that is motivated by ethics toward environment. Because as we know, Dr. Chris already mentions about the economic services from the ecosystem services. That's the benefit that we get from the ecosystem. So I think this is, I hope these discussions will bring you along on how an example of a company preparing their actions, their sustainable business management, and at the end going down to on how we are doing in relation with biodiversity. Right. So yeah, in an effort to achieve sustainable business growth, Pertamina is committed to maintain the balance and preserve of nature, environment, and community. So we believe that business models is the value of interconnecting or meeting up between value creations between companies and also stakeholders. In this context are institutions, local communities, governments, and any other parties. All parties have their own lofty ideas, and the best way is if we use the business model or the operations of the company, and we view it as the place where they are interconnecting and sharing. So I think that's the big idea. And in this context, we try to keep the balance, and this commitment is realized through the fulfillment of social and environmental responsibility, you may say CSR, which is support ESG management, as well as effort to achieve the sustainable development goals. Moving on, the company Pertamina has issued a sustainability policy in response to the global dynamics that promotes sustainable practice for sustainable business through ESG management. So we establish our ESG committees, and also we make sure that all of our operational and also strategic directions are in alignment with our ESG management, as well as with sustainable development goals. So the sustainability policy includes the company's initiatives to better integrate the company's strategies and activities in the ESG context, especially by contributing to human resources. And in our company right now, it is in a discourse to evolve to human development, because we believe that human resources is a very good, human resources management is a very good skills that can be transferable when we are interact with community development. And other than that, we also trying to contribute to environment, economic, and also social development, as well as SDG. So this is in line with Pertamina's vision, actually, which is we want to be a leading and reputable global energy company, which is we've been already there. We've been in the Fortune 500, but we want also to be recognized as environmentally friendly, socially responsible, and good governance company. So I'd like to bring you into one by one of those three visions that we have. The first one is let's dive in toward being environmental friendly company. So the question is, so what's in it for the company by being more environmental friendly? I think this is a question that can create or generate many answers, but we wanted to be recognized as an environmental friendly company because we get so many from the nature, and it is just and fair to give back to the mother nature by preserve and protect them. Our commitment to sustainability is driven by the awareness to not compromising the ability of our future generations in meeting their needs. So hopefully, in our ethical explanation is that despite the idea that energy companies are engaged in non-sustainable business, we wanted to commit and aim for a more authentic sustainability purpose. So this idea will be the soul of every actions that we have. We strive to provide and promote access to energy and also develop new and renewable energy, the things that is more friendly to our environment, to support the national climate transition agenda. And we also responsible for addressing climate change issues and to be exemplary in conducting environmental management system related to our activities. So some examples that I can share in here, for example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, other waste, and address wider climate change issue through managing regulatory, reputational, as well as market risk of climate change by integrating in our strategy and operations. We try to protect and conserve the environment, water, other natural resources, and energy through an environmental management system related to our activities, and will be monitored continuously in every level of our company, either in the unit level, business level, or even in the corporate level. And also the third one, we manage and mitigate the impact of our project and activity on biodiversity, which with a commitment of having NPI, net positive impact, as a goal by avoiding operation in every environmental highest biodiversity value, and incorporating biodiversity requirement in project planning and operations. And the good news is that we've already have the guidance to create a biodiversity action plan. So I think maybe later on I can be in connect with Dr. Chris in consulting on how we should align our policies and our activities in the context of biodiversity conservations in the region. And lastly, rehabilitate lands upon site closures. You know, after operations in oil and gas, we have abandonment and site restorations. So we have to make sure that we rehabilitate the land upon the site closures to restore the ecosystem, minimize the negative impacts, and maximize benefit. So I think that's the thing that I can share as the opening of our discussions about environment. Secondly, let's move into the context of social. As we want to be the socially responsible company, we are committed to implement the high standard for health and safety practices, continuously respects and engage the surrounding communities to stimulate sustainable social and economic development. We also commit to promote and uphold continuous employee development. We manage the diversity within the company and human rights principle. And last year, our CEO already established Pertamina's human rights policy for the company's guidance in advocating for human rights in the working place. And thirdly, is about a good governance company. So we want to make sure that we are, I would say, upholds the high standard of good corporate governance practices. And the examples of our commitments are become the social development locomotive to stimulate social and economic development in communities. We also commit to consult with stakeholders on environmental issues, with the local or surrounding communities on community development and community involvement issue to improve their welfare. So we don't want to be judgmental, but we are consulting wherever we are going to do some community development activities. And I think this activity is very connected with the entity that I lead, which is Pertamina Foundations, because we did so many activities in doing community development in rural area, and also in remote areas, and also the local communities all around Indonesia. And lastly, we respect the right of local or indigenous people or community where the company operates, including promoting the social economic development, sponsor full realizations of their social, economic, and cultural rights. So, right. So I think that's enough for our activity. I would like to jump into the biodiversity actions.
Yeah.
Until the end of
much time, so we'll have to
right,
be
yeah. So until the end of 2021, Pertamina has implemented more than 300 biodiversity protection programs. The program's target were endemic and protected species based on the IUCN Red List and the Minister of Environment and Forestry regulations of the Republic of Indonesia concerning species of protected plants and animals. And for example, last year, we does the mangrove recovery program that was affected by one incident of oil spill. And we do the mangrove enrichment 6 times the numbers of the affected individuals exposed to oils. So we do the more than 200,000 mangrove conservations for compensating the 30,000 mangrove that is affected by the oil spill. And for this year, through Pertamina Foundations, we kicked out the Blue Carbon Initiative that is aiming for reforesting mangrove vegetations as many as 11 million trees for the next 3 to 5 years in 4 different areas in Indonesia. And of course, in those situations, we also using sustainability compass as the parameter in doing community development, better environment conservations, and better biodiversity and life conservations. Lastly, about the biodiversity in our project, we aim to help conservations of orangutan, bekantan, and freshwater dolphins or pesut mahakam, the one that is endemic to Borneo Island or Kalimantan, and also whale shark in Papua. And the interesting fact about the whale shark in Papua is that instead of being a transit point during their adventure in roaming the oceans, the whale in Teluk Cendrawasih in Papua resides there the whole years. And I've spoken with the National Park Authority, and the data taken from the tag that being put into the whale shows that some of them even roam the oceans from Teluk Cendrawasih, Papua to Philippine Sea, then up north to US, and finally back again to Teluk Cendrawasih. So I think it's become more interesting as there are preliminary research that shows the importance of whale and their relatives in cetacean family, that they are contributing as being the carbon sequestrations. So the research is still preliminary, but I think for sure that further research needs to be done and could be supported by the project that we did. So that's the idea on how, even though driven by the regulations, an energy company, they have the ESG management, and it helps us to move to the better line, better, and also in par with other industries and other companies worldwide. And also we are I would say being driven by the increasing awareness and also increasing pressure from the movement and also government entities and also multinational corporate communities such as COP26, G20, and also the most recent is COP15. So I think there's nothing wrong by looking for or driven by ESG rating. As long as you have the correct motive, you can still embrace the new paradigm of authentic sustainability as the key of being ethical toward the environment. So I think that's the idea. Maybe we can elaborate further in the question and answers. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. So a quick question for transition is, you're at Pertamina. It's a company that has a responsibility to contribute the energy needs of the fourth largest population nation in the world.
Yes.
And now this sustainability and biodiversity, and this is an ethical transition. Would you say that there is an ethical mindset change within Pertamina that is being driven by Pertamina as an example, and we're seeing this in other companies?
Yeah. So to share to you and everyone in this forum, when we go with the project, for example, the blue carbon initiatives, the question is, why blue carbon? Why the oceans? And then the answer that comes up in the discussions of the board is that we are archipelago countries, and oil and gas operations or energy operations in distributing our products throughout the countries mainly done in the sea. So it's very fair and just for us to give back to the oceans and also marine ecosystem and environment. So I think this is more into ethical calls rather than I would say just a project, because we are not, frankly speaking, if you are using the approach of in the safety operations, we know the term of prescriptive base, right? So
prescriptive base, okay.
All right. So when you do all the things correctly, prescriptive base, you already check all the checklist. There is no more pressure to do beyond the checklist.
Right.
But what we did in here is go beyond the checklist. So I think it's more driven by the ethical motive.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll come to the panel in a minute, but I have a quick message also in this forum. So I'm going to change hats from moderator to speaker, and I promise it's going to be very short. I'm going to take 5 minutes, and I'm going to change hats now to put on to talk about what does this mean at the human dimension. So I have one slide. Siri, can you give us that slide?
Yes, of course.
Okay. The idea here is that sustainability and biodiversity are not just nature or man's relationship with nature, but it's also something that is happening within humanity and within organizations as well. And so the concept that we are promoting on sustainability also affects organizations, it also affects the world of work. And so the sustainable workforce that we are promoting is one that is actually is as a new thing, just like the protection of the environment is a new thing for companies. This new thing is that obviously in traditional way of managing people and managing work is that people make the company successful. That's half of the equation. The sustainable part of the workforce is that the company then needs to ensure the sustainable development of the workforce, and not just employees, but the stakeholders, the suppliers, the partners, and the local social context or ecosystem in which these companies are working. So this is something that is an ethics of sustainability, and obviously diversity is coming very much into managing people as well, that you see in companies that, and those of you who are in the workplace can probably see this as a tendency or as a shift. Those of you who will be moving into the workplace, if you're students still, it's something that you can start looking at which companies are moving into this sustainable workforce kind of model and this new paradigm. Now, I'm going to stop there on that so that we can then go to the panel. So I'm going to go back, take off my hat, go back to my role as mediator, and we can start with the panel discussion. And we have a few minutes for that. So we have some questions. I think we started with some questions for Dr. Chris. And would you like to, Siri, can you help us with one question for Dr. Chris, and then we'll have another one for Pak Bulo.
Yes, of course. Please hold on a second. So from Abigail, she asks, hi, media educator here, DLSU University of Perpetual Help. For you as an expert in your field, how can media help in spreading awareness or increasing visibility for sustainability in the ASEAN region?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Abigail. The media is certainly an important partner in increasing awareness and engagement, and there's a myriad of ways by which media can do this. One way is featuring biodiversity in all sorts of different stories, and we notice how important the human element is in these kinds of stories. So apart from providing accurate information, another is finding a way to really bring out the connection among people and flora and fauna. For example, you have a lot of charismatic species, you have a lot of endangered species that may not be endangered, and we easily take for granted, like bees and other pollinators. So these are things that the media can certainly feature in its stories, in its videos, and there are many ways by which to do that. Thank you.
Thanks. Now I see that Roldan de Santos has got a question for Mr. Bulo, but he hasn't written it yet. So while we're waiting for the question, I'm going to ask the second question to you as well as to the others. It's about sanctions. It's one of the major issues of ASEAN in terms of human rights, in terms of biodiversity, and a lot of other things, regulations, policies, even trade, is we've got a lot of nice principles, but when people actually don't do what they need to do, we have no way of sanctioning them. Chris, do we have any way of doing sanctions for those people that violate the principles or that don't comply?
Well, there are certainly, thanks for that question, and there are certainly sanctions in the national level for violations. And there are many laws across the 10 ASEAN member states within their national jurisdiction for violations of environmental policies and whatnot. There is no regional mechanism for these sanctions. Right. There's no, the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, doesn't have a sanctions framework right. for its state parties, but there are other laws where sanctions can be applied.
Thank you.
Or sorry, international treaties, if we're going by national, right. regional, and international.
Right. I think one of the things about COP15 is it's not only about sanctions, but it's about incentives, because now the recognition is that there is a huge amount of economic benefit that companies, that countries and regions that take care of biodiversity and promote biodiversity can benefit. So there's an economic investment actually in the region. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. Certainly, there are discussions in the negotiations about incentives, positive incentives, and even negative incentives, and the push to prevent negative incentives from being promoted. There isn't a lot of discussion about sanctions because, like I said earlier, the TBT doesn't have a sanctions framework, but its main thrust is really to work together, have a multi-stakeholder approach towards achieving the three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this includes, as you said, taking into consideration incentives, taking into consideration partnerships with business, as Julius said, how important it is to do that, and really being inclusive in the discussions. And that's why there are youth representatives, women representatives, indigenous peoples, and local communities.
Thank you. Okay, I've got this. Now we've got the question from Roldan. Siri, you want me to just read it out?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So here we are. You're working in an energy company and stepping up to different sources of energy. Is that a part of your company's sustainable future? Actually, sustainable for the country, because you're a state-owned enterprise, but sustainable for the company itself. How do you see that?
All right. Okay. Thank you, Roldan de los Santos, for the questions. So we are actively and intensively are moving toward new and renewable energy, because but we have to because the sustainability or the continuance of our company is really strategic toward the provisions of energy to Indonesia. But we have to remember that portions of energy mix is talking also about initiative from the company, from the public sectors and private sectors, but also initiative from the government in trying to make sure that we are achieving this kind of energy mix. In Pertamina, for example, now instead of doing the conservative oil and gas businesses, we also do battery, we also do geothermals, and we also invite some research in trying in creating new and renewable energies. Especially, for example, in my entity, Pertamina Foundations. This is the foundations which is established by Pertamina, Indonesian State-owned enterprise. We are every year we are inviting scientists or even researchers or even tech practitioners from all over Indonesia to do the competitions in presenting the ideations or the new innovations in new and renewable energy. So at the end, we hope that we can find one or two feasible ideas, and then it can goes up to the incubations that will be done in the business scheme by Pertamina. So the answer is yes.
Thank you. So we have only a few minutes. So you guys that are listening in, please type in your questions. We have all four of our panelists here. And I'd like to ask a question of Anjali and Ian. You're just starting out your careers, right? And as you look forward, because much of the reflection that we have about sustainability and biodiversity is about the future. What is your degree of confidence that when you're working in 10 or 15 years in your career, that ASEAN will be a better place? and why? Ian, would you like to begin with that one?
Yeah, perhaps I can start. Well, me, I prefer to be an optimist. I know we're experiencing many issues today, many sustainability issues. But when I look at ASEAN in 10 to 15 years, I'd like to stay optimistic because, like what I mentioned earlier, compared to developed nations, ASEAN is actually at a good position to in terms of designing how it wants to be its future decades from now. And we already have the solutions, for example, coming from the experiences of developed countries. So, why not benchmark from those solutions and try to create these collaborations, a multi-sectoral collaboration, as we usually mention. And I think in 10 to 15 years, it's possible that we could have, as we say, a greener future, a safer future. And yeah, and given the ASEAN principles of trying to collaborate in as much as we can in different sectors, it's something that we could definitely consider in the long term. Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. How about you, Anjali?
Yeah, I think I agree a little bit with Ian's point. Given that we do have cases of successful efforts in addressing biodiversity loss, we are not devoid of information. ASEAN has huge resources in terms of collaboration and diversity in different perspectives and whatnot. And I think we are able to tell in the next, not even 10 to 15 years, by 2030, we can already know whether or not our countries are committing towards our nationally determined contributions. And from then on, we can know that whether or not we are on the right track. So as for now, until 2030, I am still hopeful because even though it seems like a very small window of opportunity, I still feel that we are on the right track and we can achieve our commitments.
Thank you. Okay, let me ask a question of Dr. Chris. So the ACB is a new institution, right? Fairly recent.
Since 2005.
2005. Okay.
Not
so
that new.
Not completely new. Okay. Our organization is 2018, so we're a bit newer. But as you look forward, and particularly if you're comparing with other regional organizations like the European Union initiatives, where do you see, like in 10 years, what the ECB will be doing? Is this going to be some very major kind of institution with all kinds of funding? Or is it going to be something that's still struggling to try to get the funding from the countries and from the stakeholders? How do you see this going forward?
Well, we see the next 10 years to be more sustainable for the ACB. First, because there is really growing appreciation for the facilitative work that we do, assisting ASEAN member states and harnessing partnerships. And second, there is traction in the appreciation of the cross-cutting nature of biodiversity. And we just saw that. We are still seeing it because of the pandemic. I am still recovering from COVID right now, actually.
Sorry to hear that.
And we see that. We see the importance of biodiversity across the various, it's multifaceted across the various facets of our lives. And it's essentially our key to survival, biodiversity and its working ecosystems. And the greater the appreciation for that and how rich biodiversity is here in the ASEAN, we see so many partners approaching us, wanting to contribute not just to the discourse, to science-based policymaking, which we are supporting through the ASEAN Clearinghouse Mechanism and the ASEAN Biodiversity Dashboard, And so it all comes together. And so we see that in the next 10 years, there will be more work for us to do as we try to achieve living in harmony with nature by 2050.
That's good news. And I think that the news that we see every day on television, aside from the war news, the climate news is always pushing in your direction. Pak Bulo, there are different kinds of companies, right? We've got in ASEAN, we've got the multinationals. Some of the multinationals are famous for their commitment to sustainability and biodiversity. We've got state-owned enterprises where you are, who have a commitment to a national mission, positive commitment. We've got a lot of startups, right? We've got the unicorn companies that are going further. And then we've got obviously the NGO organizations, social enterprise, quite a few being created. What would you say is the specificity of a state-owned company that has a social and now an ethical contribution for sustainability and biodiversity? Would you say that this is something that is going to is compared to other types of companies, is going to take a leadership position, or is it going to be a follower?
Right. So, well, it's interesting questions, Bob. Firstly, there are many state-owned enterprise, but not all state-owned enterprise are big companies, right? So things is getting more central when it is a big state-owned enterprise, and when you are engaged in a business that relates with the economy or the life of the country. So I think that's become more central. So in the context of, for example, state-owned enterprise, the first thing that they have to do, in addition to commercial activities, they have the role as the agent of development, because they are state-owned enterprise. And when they do the agent of development, in the example of the company where I work for, we have to align our net zero emission roadmap with the nationally determined contributions of Indonesia. So I think this is one example on how agent of development and the central and the way we are trying to adhere or align with the national policy. And secondly, is that are we going to lead or not? The answer is to achieve the 2030 target or even 2060 target. We cannot ask the government to do it by themselves. The government has to work hand in hand with corporations, private sectors, or public sectors. But the thing that the government can do is, and more controllable toward the government, is state-owned enterprise. So I think in this case, the answer to your questions is yes. State-owned enterprise will take the lead in activities regarding environmental sustainability.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple of questions and we're running out of time. So I'm gonna really jump very shortly into these questions. The last question that just came up was to me about the recording, and the answer is yes. Siri, you can explain that as we conclude for all the participants, if they can get a recording. Let me come to the one about laborers and unions to assist the transition to a more sustainable workforce. And here I'm going to ask Anjali and Ian what you're doing. Are you actually studying how different sectors in the workforce are being able to make business and the world more sustainable? Is this something that you're studying?
Perhaps I can start.
Yeah, Ian.
Well, we do have classes on, for example, organizational development, where we look at how employees can contribute to different sustainability initiatives. And for example, this could be as simple as being more conscious of how they consume electricity within the office. Although I do want to answer this question from another perspective, beyond what we learn from classes. And I think in ASEAN, we have a very big informal economy, and most of these involves informal workers. And for us to transition to a more sustainable economy, we have to find a way to formalize the employment of these workers. Because, for example, if you're part of the informal sector, you don't have, for example, health benefits, or you're not covered by any government plans or incentives. So personally, I think part of the transition should be formalizing the informal economy from my perspective. Yeah.
Okay, but then you have the indigenous problem, Anjali, about maybe they don't want to have a job. Maybe they want to stay working and doing what they're doing, right? Are you studying that part? Because it's a big part of the COP15 as well, as I've seen in the documents.
Yeah, we don't really study that in depth, but then again, I do agree it goes back again to the ethics of deciding what is suitable for your own community, and not it's kind of trying to balance their social livelihoods and their development.
Okay.
But yeah, going back to the question on sectors and laborers and unions, I think it's really important to highlight as well, because when I talk to new people about what I do, what I study, they tend to become a bit shy to explain what they do, because they'll say, oh, I'm on the bad side of sustainability, or the evil side. And I think that's, it's not really black and white, I would say.
Right.
It's
Sort of
important
black and
that you, it's good that you acknowledge that there are practices in the business that is not ethical in a sense. And it's really important that you highlight those things, not just to your peers, but also in the workforce. So yeah, I think that's a crucial point as well.
Okay. I'll end the questions with this one from Mel Gregg, Conception, and he talks about the Philippines and mining. So, I mean, obviously, oil and gas are also mining industries, but you've got all kinds of mining industries. And he talks about the Philippines, which you would know. And so the question is, what is being done for mining? Because I know that there are specific ethical protocols and frameworks for mining in a biodiverse segment. Are you dealing a lot with those kind of issues, Dr. Chris?
Well, there are many considerations.
Yes.
Mining.
You're writing about that in your books, right?
I did write about that in my book. And the important thing that we need to remember, over and beyond greenwashing, for example, is the need to engage. Whether it's the extractive industry, the infrastructure industry, all these industries, and there's a great possibility that these industries just need to understand what's at risk, what the opportunities are, and what they can do to become more sustainable, and have sustainability, have biodiversity conservation and biodiversity considerations and sustainable use as part of their corporate model. And so engagement and dialogue is very important, because there is a way to translate all this that we have talked about in ethics and sustainability in a way that will resonate among these various industries. And it will be difficult. It will be more challenging if we do not engage, because inaction costs as much as action does. And so we just need to be able to keep talking, keep looking for solutions, and keep working together to implement these solutions. And somehow we will get there, and we will get that sustainability, and we will secure a better future, a better normal for everyone in the future generations.
Thank you. And I think that's a nice conclusion. So I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of remarks. So we started out with this, with a fantastic panel. So thanks to all of you, and obviously to all of you who have come into this conversation through your questions, and then even if you're not asking questions, to pay attention to this, and you can use the recording, and you can be able to use this as a means of communication. But basically, we started out with this massive question of sustainability and biodiversity in an area that itself is so diverse and also very big. And so thanks to Anjali and Ian for giving us an overview, number one. Number two, I think just your presence shows that ASEAN is taking steps towards creating experts and facilitating the development of a capability of the region to be able to do more. The video of the UN, I thought was first of all, thanks to the UN for creating this video clip for us to sort of explain what they're doing. And we talked about some of the important things that are coming out of this. And so this is something you will start to see in the news more and more. When Dr. Chris gave us a specific overview of the many actions that ASEAN is taking, and particularly I thought it was encouraging, and I was pleasantly surprised, I must say, that the frustration of not getting things done is actually better balanced by the encouragement and the engagement that the countries are giving you in your role, and as you can see that things are moving forward towards in a positive way, and you're going to have a more important role in the future. When it comes to companies, the tendency is always to talk about, well, the greenwashing and what is done in terms of destruction of the environment, or the inattention or even opposition to measures for sustainability. But at the same time, the companies have a tremendous importance to be able to move in the direction if you can start to make a change. And I think what Pak Bula was explaining to us in the example of the company that he's working in at Pertamina, that there is a sort of mindset change in ethics that is allowing companies to go from just being compliant to the rules to actually a more proactive ethic of trying to build a future, and in your case, a future in which we will still need energy, but then the question of the production of the energy and how that can contribute to biodiversity is something that we can look forward to in a positive way. So I think it was a very interesting debate. I was very happy to see how much of the ethical question was able to be addressed. And I think this is really a good chance for somebody who's interested in the ethics of sustainability and biodiversity to get a view and to get your own perspective on where you stand on some of these issues. Thanks very much. Now I'd like to hand over to Siri for the final conclusion.
All right, thank you so much everyone for being here today. I hope that the discussions and the presentation has enriched your understanding of biodiversity and sustainability in Southeast Asia. And we will have a recording of this webinar uploaded to the AUN Secretariat official YouTube channel that you can search, so you can watch this session again. And for the audience who would like to fill in our post-event survey with the link in the with the QR code here in order to receive your certificate of participation, and it will greatly help us with the organization of the next webinar. So if you would like to receive your certificate, please make sure to fill in the survey so we know where to send them and all of that. And the link should also be in the chat. Yeah, so we'll have it on for a while, but Yes, thank you everyone for coming again. And thank you once again so much for the panelists for taking your time to educate us on such insightful discussions on biodiversity and sustainability. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day, and thank you so much again.